40 years ago, in 1972. It's been out of print for a long time. And in the last 15, 20 years, I tried several times, spoke to publishers about reprinting it, but nobody was keen, and I could understand why. But it began to seem a bit of a lost cause. And I was thinking in terms of publishing it myself, perhaps as an e-book. And then Robert Yo, who was an old boy and a former teacher at St. Andrews, encouraged me to talk to Gofan, yeah. And when I spoke to him, I was surprised when he readily said yes, which is why we're here today. So thank you, Gofan and Waihan, his wife, for taking on this book, for agreeing with me that it's something that should get back into circulation. And thank you, Robert, for pushing me to do so. Why did I want to see Memoirs of a Migrant reissued, come back in print? It wasn't just a case of a daughter wanting to do right by the father, though of course there's some element of that. As a Singaporean, I would like to see a much richer documentation of our history. More accounts of the lives led by people, a whole range of people, both extraordinary and ordinary. The Singapore we see around us today was built by many, many people, not just leaders who deserve the accolades. But a lot of us contributed to it. And I think we should be hearing and reading their stories, their realities, and their truths. Also, I think Memoirs of a Migrant does offer some lessons, and I would like to read a few lines from it just to illustrate this thing. One lesson is that it is okay to admit to having weaknesses, to having made mistakes. This my father does in excess in his book. One friend who read it recently said to me after, she read it in one go, he said to me after that, he's very honest about himself, isn't he? Brutally honest. I think it's something a lot of us might want to think about doing. Another lesson is the approach he took to people. And let me quote a few lines from the book. It is part of the interest of the world that people have different races and languages and ways of life. I don't regard everyone as equal. I just don't think in those terms at all. People are people. Sometimes troublesome, sometimes pathetic, nearly always kind. Trying to classify races as superior or inferior is a futile waste of time. One point that comes up again and again in Memoirs is his frustration with bureaucracy, with structures and systems that reward conformity and stifle individuality and initiative and creativity. As a teacher and principal, my father was always much more concerned about the laggards, the misfits, the naughty boys, the rebels, the forgotten and the misunderstood, the underdogs. And he writes, and then he quote again, we must not, and in his book he emphasized not in capitals, we must not close our minds and hearts to the needs of those who do not neatly fit into the schemes of our changing society. The schemes change rapidly. What we reject today may be the keystone, the next thing we have to build, which is a point not always understood or accepted by Singapore's policymakers, the people who used to sit here and who now occupy a more glorious chamber across the world. Singapore is changing even more rapidly today, and all the more we need those who question, who challenge the status quo and the sacred cows, and who have new ideas to offer. This second edition of Memoirs has additional material. We've just reproduced the original book in its entirety, nothing changed, we didn't try to update anything as it is. But we've included some more photographs, and a selection of my father's other writings, speeches, some very short, some quite long. Most of this material was his speeches and so on, were written in the 1970s, but many of the points he made still hold true today. For example, in one speech, I think it was at an OBA dinner, he said this: "We are moving into a depersonalized society where the individual loses value and is treated as a unit of cost. Our revolution must be to recognize the personal value of each individual, his right to be different, and to follow his own way of life. This will not be easy in the new Singapore, but it is vital for the future." He made the speech in 1974, it's 40 years ago. We are now in that future he was talking about, and we are still struggling to get away from being treated as a unit of cost. So finally, there is in this edition a section called Tributes to Francis Thomas. In 1978, about a year after he died, his old friend Devon Nair, who was then running the NTUC, wrote to St Andrews alumni and various others, former political colleagues and so on, asking them for contributions to a book he was planning that he wanted to call Memorial to a Migrant. He got a handful of responses, but he was too busy to chase around for more material and to complete the project. And I was not yet a journalist and much too young in any case to attempt to complete what he started. He eventually passed the material to me, and has been sitting in my files for, well, 40 years, 35 years. And I'm very glad that we're finally able to do justice to both Devon and my father by publishing these tributes. That's all I have to say. We've got various family members here, and on behalf of my family, thank you all very much for coming and for supporting this event. And I'll turn it over to the various speakers, all of whom knew my father in one capacity or another. And we worked with him on the Anglican Welfare Council Committee and was in the social service sector. Robert Yeo was an old boy and a teacher. Catherine Lim was a teacher. She was my teacher at St Andrews School because I did my I must tell you this story. My father was principal in the 60s, and we lived in the Woodsville House, which is the principal's house. In those days, the principals lived there. And I had done my O-levels at Methodist Girls' School, and I didn't want to go on to where most MGS girls go on to, which is ACS when I was born. And I didn't ask for that. And so we had, after doing your O-levels, we had to fill in this form. And this was the practice in those days. And by the way, my year was the last year of O-level people who did not have a JC to go to. The first JC, NJC, opened its doors just in time for the people here after me, which included Stienberg. Anyway, so I initially filled in, I think my first choice was Raffles or something like that. But sheer sloth got the better of me. Because I looked at this again before submitting it. Now, if I get to Raffles or wherever, I have to wake up at whatever time to get to school by 7. And I put St Andrews first, and I go to the school. I can roll up to bed 10 minutes before the bell and walk to school, which is what I did. And the sloth got the better of me, and I ended up going to the school my father was principal of, which was a bit awkward at times. But I'm glad because it gave me a deeper sense of being a saint. So again, thank you all for coming, and Anne will start off.
Because obviously Captain Adams they want to fight, I'll introduce rugby. And if they still want to fight, we'll have some boxing. That was pretty, I think, unusual in those days. So Francis inherited this great tradition. And it's wonderful that we're having these memoirs. I see Lena has just come in. I remember Lena telling me that there was a very limited market for memoirs. The trouble is that's a very keen market. Maybe a lot of people are not interested, but those who are interested are desperately interested. And I think it's marvellous that we're getting this new edition. I have to confess my personal contacts with Francis were fairly limited and relate only really to the Anglican counselling, schools counselling service, which was a really pioneering. Nobody else was doing anything to do with schools counselling at that time. Well, I can't speak for the Catholic schools, maybe they did, but the first institutionalised counselling for schools was this Anglican schools counselling service. But it was, and already one knew about Francis Thomas because from the social work world, he had another unique characteristic, was that, as those of you who are old enough to know, Singapore was very largely just a network of shanty towns and kampongs. Even in the late 60s, 31% of households were living in a wooden house. And around St. Andrews at Kotok Pasir, there was an enormous kampong. Although actually kampongs, too good a word, they were only shanty towns, they weren't organized kampongs. And Francis Thomas had his students going out and doing communities investigations and trying to provide some kind of service. I don't know all the details, but I know we were very impressed at the way the boys from St. Andrews were encouraged to get down there and find out how people were living. The schools counselling service, the trouble was that quite soon other schools wanted this service as well, and so the title became not quite appropriate. And from the schools counselling service grew the schools counselling service, which is still, maybe I got the name wrong, but it's still there out as a multi-centred service. And the service was quite unique. And I think he was really pioneering something much bigger, because the Anglican side of it became Anglican welfare, which is now Anglican community services. And the other side of it became the secular counselling for all schools. And Singapore hasn't got that many secular voluntary NGOs. We've been lucky that the religions in Singapore, all kinds of, going right back to the Buddhist anti-opium societies, we've had all the religions providing services, but we don't have that many secular services. And out of Anglican welfare and out of Anglican schools counselling, then grew a much bigger organisation that's still flourishing today. Thank you, Margaret.
I'd like to speak about Francis Thomas as a person who personally empowered me. I relate, those of you who have read my memoirs for the Roots, two incidents in which he made me feel that I was, what is the word, somebody. I mean, I was a young teacher. I taught in St. Andrew's School from about 62 to about 66, and one day I went up to him because I had been very impatient teaching literature and romantic literature to my pre-U 1 and 2 students. And if you know a little bit of English history, romantic literature stopped with Keats. And I went up to Mr. Thomas and I said, Mr. Thomas, are we going to pretend that English literature stopped with Keats? Because no school I think there was one other school, reference institution, offered to teach the modern paper. The modern paper would be writers of the 20th century. So I complained to him, I said, Mr. Thomas, we cannot remain stuck in the romantic period. I would like to do something about the literature curriculum in PU1 and PU2. I said, what would you like to do? I said, I would like to teach the modern writers. And he pulled out from his drawer a modern curriculum, and he looked at the list of D26 T.S. Eliot, selected poems, W.B. Yeats, selected poems, Robert Graves, Goodbye to All Them, James Joyce, Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. Are you sure you want to teach these people? I said, yes, Mr. Thomas, I'll try. I was a young, fresh graduate, and I thought I could conquer the world, at least as far as teaching T.S. Eliot. And James Joyce was concerned. And Thomas says, I'll think about it. And the next day he said, go ahead. And that was how the modern paper was introduced to Stienberg School. I'm very proud of it. I had a lot of problems teaching T.S. Eliot. But if you ask some of my students, some of whom may be here, they'll remember that I was a good teacher, reasonably good teacher of Joyce's novel, The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. And so I must thank Francis Thomas for giving me the chance to do something a little bit, well, for those times, a little bit extraordinary. The only other school that dared to teach it was reference institution. I think they taught it for 2 straight years, and they dropped it. Why? Because the results were bad. A familiar refrain in Singapore. And the other thing that which he empowered me was one day I read an article in a magazine called NYLTI. I don't quite remember what magazine it was. It was some anime magazine. And then I saw an article by Francis Thomas, and guess what? Francis Thomas had quoted Robert Yo. I flipped. Well, I mean, my principal quoting my poems, you know how wonderful it felt to be quoted, and how wonderful to be quoted by your principal. Francis Thomas was that kind of person who empowers people. And I'm going to look, and I could go on talking about it for a long time already. But I'm going to end by quoting a letter they wrote to me. I've got here in front of me 6 letters they wrote to me, and I do hope in time we might be able to do a biography of it. Someone else might get about it and we could do these letters. And I'm going to read them to you because I think I am. Thanks. You can see it's dated. He wrote this to me 1967 when I was a student in London. Thanks. And I'm going to read it. School news. TV Singapura have persuaded Raffles St Andrews to play a special match on Sunday next in the Padang to be televised live as part of a series of rugged society telecasts of rugby. I think no letter from one thing to another is complete without reference to rugby. The other 2 matches are an Australian EMU team on Saturday and combined services on Monday. We beat Raffles for the 1967 Rugby Championships at Jalan Besar, but they won a new cup, the Kiwi Cup, for scoring more points than we did on our 2 friendlies. And he goes on to say, this morning I I came 6 strokes each to Balawan Singh, San King King, and Chua King Soon for beating up Chan Wan Singh and Man Kiang in Moonstone Day yesterday. The best afraid caused someone to phone up for the police, who sent a patrol car and brought the 2 beat-up victims to my house for the school to take action. And then he ends with a piece about Margaret and Margaret's condition. My daughter Margaret is getting a brilliant result and will be lucky if she has a clear entry to preview class. Of the results announced so far, she has A2, B6, and B7. I hope we can sneak her into our preview arts lesson. She hates the idea of being under me as principal, which I take as a compliment. I could go on.
Slightly different account of how I got personality.
I could go on about Francis Thomas, but I must end with something which I think is historically correct. I think it might be in this house at the time when the David Hawke government was in trouble for a scandal related to his education minister, that when Francis Thomas crossed over, and I think David Hawke lost his majority. And I think Study Pandu referred to that event and said that Francis Thomas, the only honest man in the Labour Party, the only honest man in the Labour Party. I leave you with that comment by Study Pandu. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here today. Can you hear me clearly? Yes. Yes. To be here today, to join in this wonderful celebration of the launch of Francis Thomas' book, and to meet up with old friends and colleagues from way back when. When Margaret first invited me to take part in this event, I was thrilled because this would give me the opportunity to pay public tribute to someone I've always held in the highest respect and regard. And now I'm going to tell you about an incident, which though small though it was, has been filed in my memory as one of the most, as I would say, one of the most significant and cherished experiences of my life. Now, more than 40 years ago, I was a young teacher in St. Andrews Secondary School when Mr. Thomas was principal. I had newly arrived from Malaysia, had just given birth to my second baby. My first one was 1.5 years old. I was desperate for a job to help my poor struggling husband, and therefore was in the worst possible position to balance the needs, the demands of family and work. And to top it all, the 2 housemates I employed to take care of my babies and do the housework were hopelessly inept, always quarreling with each other and neglecting my children. Now, a typical day for me at St. Andrews would be something like this. During recess and sometimes in between lessons, I would rush to the common phone in the staff room to make a frantic call home to check to see whether my babies had been fed, had been washed, had been given their medicine. And each call would end with me shrieking exasperated instructions into the phone. I was such a mess. And one day I knew that I had come to the end of my tether. I went to Mr. Thomas' office and said tearfully I was resigning because I couldn't cope anymore. Now, I'll never forget the kind look he gave me and the words he said, calmly and reassuringly. He said, "Don't leave, we need you. Go and take as much leave as you need and then come back." Now, as it turned out, I took only 2 days, and it would be a while before I understood the full implications of that seeming benign act of a principal in the context of the regulations and the rules that govern schools in those days in a fairly rigid educational system. Now, if Mr. Thomas had abided by regulations, I probably would have to apply formally for leave and then wait for the processing of the application. I would have to come back at the appointed date and so on. As it turned out, he just dismissed all these requirements. It was an act of courageous initiative. Courageous because, goodness, if you were a principal, you couldn't give that kind of carte blanche to an officer who could very well abuse it. Now, but it was his spontaneous, his trusting generosity that made him dismiss all the administrative what-ifs and buts. All he saw was a staff member in distress, and all he wanted to do was to relieve that distress. Other things could come later. A small enough incident, but since then, you know, it has come to me, it has come to embody for me what I consider the three most important attributes of the human condition: compassion, courage, and trust. Now, years later, when my first book of short stories came out, an interviewer commented that although my stories were often touched with a hard-edged sense of irony and even cynicism, they were always underlaid by passionate humanity. And I was almost tempted to tell the interviewer about that incident, that inspiring incident in my life so many years ago. And now I must tell you something different about a regret. Yes, a regret, because I really regretted that I had not made use of an opportunity to reciprocate that act. Not with compassion and kindness, because Mr. Thomas, in his position as principal, didn't need that, but with something like thoughtfulness and cheer, which I think he would have appreciated. Now let me explain. As an English language teacher, I often had the pleasure of coming across howlers, you know, student mistakes in my students' compositions. Mistakes as a result of misspellings, wrong use of words, distortions, contortions of English syntax, and so on. I'm sure you're familiar with these mistakes, right? And if I had shared them with Mr. Thomas, who had a certain sense of humor, I think he would have been entertained. And now I'm going to entertain you by giving you examples of these student howlers. Not from my collection, but even better, from a compilation, a certain book published internationally. These are submissions by small children in their history test. The inhabitants of ancient Egypt were called mummies. They lived in the Sahara Desert and traveled by Camelot. In the Olympic Games, Greeks ran races, jumped, hurled the biscuits, and threw the Java. During the Renaissance, America began. Christopher Columbus was a great navigator who discovered America while cursing about the Atlantic. When Lincoln was president, he would only wear a tall silk hat. Queen Victoria was the longest queen and sat on a throne for 63 years. But the real gems for me came from the older students. Now here are two examples. I just love them, and I've taken them down because they are gorgeous, based on misspellings. The first one based on a misspelling, the second one later. Now, the first one, written probably by a student of agriculture, and the sentence goes like this. The soil here is very fertile, as it is full of microorganisms. Wonderful misspelling. And another one, this one, based on an equally delightful malapropism. Sir Francis Drake circumcised the world with a Now my examples are not really as spectacular, but I'll give you two examples that I've taken from the general paper essays of my students. I taught the general paper, and as you know, it was a compulsory paper. And being a very exam-conscious teacher, my God, I was exam-conscious. I would scrutinize past year exam papers to find out what were recurring areas that examiners would be interested in to test the students visits it. And I found one. Every year, without fail, the examiners would test the candidate's ability to write on various aspects of his own country. For example, what your government was doing to help the poor, the generation gap, how tradition was being affected by modernity, and so on. Now, I would encourage my students to concentrate on these topics and to choose them for the exams for two distinct advantages. I knew that if they write on familiar topics, they would write more confidently, and another bigger advantage, a psychological one. Their GP essays would contain information that was new and even novel to the examiner, who might never have been to Singapore or this part of the world. And just by being interested in your essay could make him well disposed towards giving the student a good grade. You see what a kiasu teacher I was. Now, I'm now going to give you two examples of the GP essays, both based on misspellings. The first one. We can be proud of our nation, Singapore, because Singapore has become an affluent nation, spelled with an E. And then the second one, again, a misspelling. In order to raise the standards of living in Singapore, the PAP government must provide better, I think the student meant to write better public facilities, but left out the L in public, so that I found myself staring at this sentence. The PAP government must provide better public facilities. Now, so there you are. You see those of you who did not heed the calling to be teachers, see what you missed. Now, as I said, I really regretted that I did not share these howlers, these student bloopers with Mr. Thomas, because I think he would have liked them. But you know, in those days, I was a young, diffident teacher, held back by all kinds of silly reservations, such as, what would the other teachers think of me? Would they see me as currying favor with the principal? So there I was, held back by all this. And now, in conclusion, I will have to say this of Mr. Thomas. You know, Maggie, your dad could never, ever have been a hugely successful politician, wielding power and influence, basking in the perks and prestige of position, because his simple human goodness would have gone in the way. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sukyang, and as you heard Margie's introduction, I fall within the category of the rascally group that must make this panel complete. And I say this because I was a student in St. Andrews, right from primary 1 to pre-university 2, and I had 3 eminent teachers on my right. So I had to be extra careful. Mrs. Stienberg was my English teacher. And when she was speaking, I was actually shivering whether she would have quoted my mistake. Unfortunately, she didn't spot any of those. Perhaps I did them pretty well. Now, I just want to share with you all that to many of you, Mr. Francis Thomas is known to be a social worker, man with compassion and heart. And he was the one who started the St. Andrews Social Work Group, which actually was community service based for students to take part in community service, to learn how to work with the community, to serve the community, even as a student.